Psalm 68, verse 33. To him that rideth upon the heavens of heavens, which were of old, lo, he doth send out his voice, and that a mighty voice. Welcome to Bible. All right, we are in this series, New Year's Cosmology, class number 10. Ether it is, or ether it isn't. All right, now, some of y'all read the word ether. Now, sometimes it can have an A with it, but basically, the more, science-based slang is E. But an A kind of has a little bit more of a metaphysical tone, which I don't have a big problem with unless you're thinking it's pagan. But basically, at this point, we have gone through and talked about a lot. You really have to go through the whole series. Okay, this is number 10 for a reason. It's not number 1. We go through all of our worldview foundations. We deal with the philosophy. We deal with the problems of the Big Bang Theory, the problems of materialism. We deal with the biblical propositions that the Bible is putting out as cosmological propositions. We also deal with the fact that there are limitations to our science and limitations to what we can observe. We can't observe what we didn't observe to begin with. But basically, right now, the last episode we talked about the limits of space, that there is a stopping point to the universe, that it's not stretching and stretching and stretching. But when we talk about space, the final frontier, what is it? Well, we start off looking at this. In Greek philosophy, they had this term, ether. What was the ether? Well, you think about it in poetry, you think of the ethereal realm, the heavens above the heavens. And essentially, what they postulated, the great philosophers of old like Ptolemy and others, is that when we see all these celestial bodies going all the way throughout the heavens, that ultimately there is a space that they fill. And since there is a space that all of these bodies are within, that space would be the ether. The ether is the substance of space. So that would conclude that space is a substance. Modern geocentrists would kind of make a point to say that ether is a fluid, not a liquid, but a fluid. In other words, the atoms, the particles, the mass, the matter, that all these things are floating. Maybe not mass, but the matter. All these things are floating within the luminous ether. Now, later on, we go through the centuries and modern science gets started, and James Clerk Maxwell gets the motor running with electromagnetism. And with his concept of the ether, he uses it in terms of dealing with electricity and light. That if light is flowing, it has to have something to flow through. And so, within that context, the ether, the luminous ether, is that vessel which the light can flow through. And they did an experiment and had experimental proof of the ether, starting out with the interferometer. Now, theologian, I could call myself a philosopher to a point. I deal with the science. I'm not a scientist, so you'll forgive me if I don't get too technical, but you might like that because you might not be into the too technical either. So, basically with the interferometer, what they were trying to measure is they were trying to measure if there was any channel between a dead vacuum of these two electric charges. And what they found is that if you had a vacuum, if you had an emptiness between these two as there is an electric charge, you wouldn't get much, but you would get a little. That there was some sort of charge that would go through what's supposed to be nothing, the vacuum. And this is good when we start talking about the theories going along with the vacuum of space. And so the idea was that light, and the light photons, the light from a star would come to the earth channeled through the luminous ether. So this became a very core concept with Newtonian physics. Now, I mean, they already understood there to be an ether. They already did understand that there was an interconnection with the universe. And so, at the end of the 1800s, they started to wrap this all up. They wanted to have all these forces considered and unified and weighed in. And so, there was a guy named Michelson. And basically, what he did was he made an experiment. And that experiment was going to prove that the ether worked fine, that the ether was consistent with the truth of heliocentricity. This was all supposed to work together. So, what they did, so you got your sun here, and then you got the good old Earth, and then you got the moon. And what they did was they shot a beam in Michigan, and they shot a beam in La France. So they shot two laser beams at the moon, and each would go back. So Paris would hit the moon with the laser beam, and it would come to Michigan, while Michigan would hit the laser beam, and it would go to Paris. Now, assuming that the Earth is rotating around the sun, assuming that there is this ether, that basically there would be the ether wind, and one side would be dragged a little slower by the flow of the ether wind. The other side should be faster. So guess what happened? What happened was that as both points hit and they came back, it was about even. And so from then, they figured that it was a null result. Zero. Now, it was zero, but it wasn't 0.0.0 perfect zero. No. There was some more stuff there. Okay? Now, the problem is that they needed enough of a flow to get the Earth around the sun, so that would have had to go at about 35 miles per second. What they got is about 4 kilometers per second. Now, at this point, we had to do some shuffling, because you had to make these two work, because geocentricity is a fact, right? So then the ether couldn't exist. But if geocentricity is a fact, as opposed to heliocentricity, and if I mix that up, figure out what I'm saying. If heliocentrism is not the fact, and that everything is revolving around the Earth instead, then there's not a problem. Now, some of these guys tried to keep the experiments going, and they tried to tweak this experiment a little bit to up it, make it a little bit more precise. So there was a guy named Davies, and he tweaked it a little bit more, and he found a ether wind going at 10 kilometers per second. Now, 10 kilometers per second is enough of a flow for a current going around the Earth. But it was not enough of a flow to get the Earth to be going around the Sun. So they figured that it was a failure. So Albert Einstein comes up with this special theory of relativity. And I believe at some point he admitted that the whole point of the special theory of relativity was to overcome the results of this Michelson-Morley experiment. Because for them, you had three options. One, that the Earth is dragging the ether as it goes around the Sun, which there have been several experiments that have been done that show that that could not be possible. Two, that the Earth was not moving, and that would make everything move around it. Or three, that there was no such thing as the ether. And so the special relativity decided that they would deny the existence of the ether. Now, years later, Einstein comes up with his general theory of relativity. The general theory of relativity states, yes, there is ether. And I'll be honest with you, I'd have to, I was researching it, but I'd have to go over it several times to kind of figure out exactly why he felt that this contradiction could go through. I think it would be that it's not a physical properties type of ether and stuff like that. But basically, his original idea is contradicted by himself as far as like the starting point of ether. There's no ether, space is a vacuum, the problem's solved. And then he's like, but in other ways there is. Basically, then they did an experiment called the Michelson-Gail experiment. Obviously, Michelson wanted to check this out again. And I'll go ahead and just show you just some pictures here, because I know I'm going to ruin it if I just try to draw it. I know everybody's been complaining. But essentially, this is a picture of the Michelson-Gail experiment. Let me see if I can get that to you. There we go. Alright, and so what they were doing with these large beams is they detected the ether, and they did detect this direction going around the Earth. You could argue whether it was the Earth spinning or not spinning, but whatever it was going around the Earth. So that was good enough for a lot of people, but it was still going along with the idea of the ether wind. So then there was another experiment done. Now, let's see if we can get this one. And this one's called the St Yak Experiment. Let's see if we can get a picture of that for you. And, I mean, just pause it so you can kind of get a good look at this. Okay. So the St Yak Experiment, it's almost like, and I'll do like my artistic representation. You already saw the picture. But imagine that you have like a baseball field on a turntable, and they shoot a photon. And when they shoot the photon at this turntable, and this is spinning around, I think about 6 times a second. I could be off, but about 6 times a second. They split the photon. One goes up, and then one goes up. Then they meet. And basically come back down. And where they meet, they should be even because the light is a constant. So this light beam is split into two. They come back down. And what happened was they found that there was a drag because one is going in this direction 6 times fast, and the empty space is dragging that photon that it's dragging against, showing that there is some substance to this. You know, ether is not air. It's not something that we think of as, you know, it's lighter than air, anti-gravity, all that kind of stuff, okay? So it's not that we're arguing for something different as far as what space is. But it does make a difference. It is a substance because it's pushing against these photons. So basically, and I think when I last checked it was light beam, so, you know, whatever. But basically when we did this, one was behind the other being dragged, showing that the ether did indeed exist. And then they had another experiment that I think it's hard to tell if it was the same thing as the Michelson-Morley experiment. They called it the silver tooth experiment. And in this, it was the U.S. Air Force did some experiments. And this is in the scientific peer-reviewed journal of Nature. I'll show you there. Okay. Just take your picture. There we go. And let's see here. Alright, the study repeated the 1887 experiment. And the field results. This is August 1986. E.W. Silvertooth, Special Relativity, Nature, Volume, let's see, what was it? I think it was Volume 322, August of 1986, page 590. And just as it has been predicted, okay, they found that there was the existence of ether. Now, this is kind of funny because when we start dealing with space and time, a lot of these guys, they don't want to deal with Michelson-Morley. They don't want to ever challenge the reality that they would set forth in the heliocentric model. And we'll take care of that in a later class. But they admit to it on the big scale. And they've done it in different ways. We talk about the curvature of the universe. They found the universe seems to curve just as much as the Earth curves. And with the curvature of the universe, they use a principle called space-time. It's really just another word for ether. But Nikola Tesla was one of, inside the circle, he was one of the most influential electrical scientists, inventors of the 20th century, all time perhaps. I mean, people didn't listen to him enough, and he had wireless technology in the 1940s. Yeah, he had the cell phone ready, and, you know, but the government, you know, made that special way of that not happening. Confiscate all his materials, okay? a lot of, we don't know what happened. He had planned on making some stuff for a more electric universe and stuff like that. And we will talk about that one pretty soon, maybe next episode. But essentially, he disagreed with Einstein on a lot of this stuff, and Nikola Tesla really felt that Einstein and a lot of these guys were depending way too much on mathematical proof instead of experimental evidence, because the experiment is reality. And the problem with math, I always go back, is 2 plus 2 plus x. What's x? It depends on what you actually see. If you see it, then you can calculate it. That's great. But if there's stuff that you're not calculating, then it's not true. And so that's been kind of the deal there. But basically, we have evidence for the ether. Meanwhile, people have given up on talking about the vacuum of space. They'll like to talk about dark matter. Now, I've shown you all these different experiments, and there's another experiment that we'll talk about later called Airy's failure, okay, because I kind of felt like that would go better with the spinning universe. But basically, these experiments give weight, give evidence, give observation, get proof, and they're repeatable, okay? These are repeatable experiments, and yet with dark matter, we've yet to find anything. We've used spectroscopy to map the universe, and we didn't see any ether, we didn't see any dark matter. We've used particle colliders to look deep within the atoms. Still didn't see any dark matter. And yet they have to have this to keep their whole model going. But the big breakdown is everything is going to go back to geocentric. Everything is going to go back to an electric plasmatic universe. And so that's what you're going to see here, and we're going to reveal in New Year's cosmology. I was also checking in with Russell Humphreys. Russell Humphreys is one of the most reputable young Earth physicists out there. And he created a cosmology to harmonize Einstein's relativity with the young Earth several years ago, and talked about time dilation and things. Well, he came out later on, 2008, and he started kind of going over some new things with the gravity and admitting to some of the reality of this ether, of this, he called it a membrane, okay? That this ether was a material. And basically, towards the end of the talk, started kind of admitting there was a wheel, started admitting that it was centripetal force that was moving the universe, and we'll talk about that in the spinning universe. But basically, the evidence is starting to drag people slowly to see the truth. And so I decided to start putting these ideas together immediately back in 2014. Why? Because I knew that as much as people were going to say I was a nut job, this is evidence. This is the truth. It's going to get out there. So basically, that's this class. Do you go with the ether or do you not go with the ether? And so now we've filled in the universe with ether. So ether it is. All right, we will see you all next class.